Naomi Byron, a Victorian legal thriller. Chapter 1. The Brief. Do you know what the dead man's walk is? No? Well, let me tell you what it is. The dead man's walk is the corridor that connects Newgate Prison with the Central Criminal Court in London, more commonly known as the Old Bailey. When a prisoner is sentenced to death, they are led through the dead man's walk to the square, where huge crowds gather to see the spectacle of a public hanging. The affluent members of the crowd sometimes reserve boxes to view the abhorrent spectacle. The less well-off ones bring rotten fruits and vegetables and stones to pelt the unfortunate prisoner. It is called the dead man's walk because the prisoners only go one way. There is no turning back. This is their final walk, whereupon they are told they are being led to meet their Creator. As they walk, the tunnels and archways grow narrower, so much so that when one reaches the final archway, it becomes difficult to go through, particularly if you are tall and broad. The logic behind the narrowing of the tunnel and archways is to mentally prepare the prisoner for their imminent death. Yes, as grim and grisly as it may sound, it is the truth. Just before the public square is a small patch called the birdcage, where a prisoner is able to catch a glimpse of the sunlight for the last time, before being confined to the darkness of his or her grave. This, ladies and gentlemen, was the state of affairs of crime and punishment in England in 1863. The administration of justice was a shambles. The judge, jury, and prosecutor barely took clemency into account. The prisoner was almost always looked upon as a monster. There were only a handful of us barristers who tried our utmost to fight for these victims of injustice. And when I retrace my visits to the miserable jails, where prisoners, many wrongfully condemned I should add, rot in sordid conditions, a blackness comes over my soul, and my hand begins to tremble. I have no appetite to consume a luxurious meal when I recall the decaying bread and gruel they are compelled to eat. When I see an enchanting sunset over the river Thames from the Thames embankment, a blend of pink and golden, and the gentle breeze caressing my face, that freedom that I take for granted, I think of these unfortunate people in their lonely dark cells, yearning for a glimpse of the sunlight which barely penetrates their narrow barred windows. My bleak thoughts would always end on the last memory I had of Susan Taylor. How I had zealously attempted to revolutionize the system, hoping to bring her justice. How she had been made a laughingstock of, and how I had failed her. I sometimes wonder whether justice actually exists, or is it merely a myth? Do we proponents of law and order and fairness diligently and truthfully fight for the cause of justice? Is that our primary aim? Or is it a selfish desire to make profit or to win a well-crafted argument and gain the applause of the jury? Do we fight for a righteous cause and for the prisoner who pins all their hopes on us? Or do we stand in the Old Bailey in our wigs and our fancy robes merely to eclipse the efforts of the opposing counsel with our rhodomantade and emerge as vain willers like gladiators fighting in the arena for glory? My sullen thoughts were interrupted. "Mr. Benedict, sir, Mr. Martindale's solicitor has come to see you. He says it is urgent. May I let him in?" Curtis, a young clerk who had joined our chambers very recently, popped his head into my office and spoke nervously lest I censured him. His father had been my clerk previously and had died suddenly. Curtis, who had received a little training from his late father, then joined Longhurst Chambers at Middle Temple, where I had been a tenant for some 13 years. Charles Longhurst was the head of chambers, and I was the only other barrister who worked alongside him. He had been my mentor and was at the time on sabbatical in India. I wondered what terrified Curtis. Was it me, an intimidating criminal defense barrister? Was it the voluminous books, statutes, briefs, and other legal documents that engulfed us? Was it the horrific facts of the crimes that he had heard solicitors narrate to me? I had been meaning to ask him, but seeing how anxious he became each time I attempted to ask him a personal question, I refrained. "You can let him in, Curtis," I replied softly. Curtis hurriedly shut the door, and I heard his quick, squeaky footsteps as he rushed to the waiting area to fetch Mr. Martindale. It was a dreary October afternoon. The pitter-patter of the rain, together with the tick-tocking of the grand clock on the wall, vexed me. I was unable to concentrate. As I looked out of the window, I saw a rather distorted image of Middle Temple, the overgrown trees, a barrister rushing about shouting out aloud that he was late for a certain hearing at the Chancery, another barrister blowing his own trumpet over his victory at the Old Bailey, recounting how the prisoner, a 15-year-old boy, was sentenced to 7 years in jail for larceny. His gruff voice was loud enough for me to hear through the window. Had they no sympathy, I thought to myself. It was at Longhurst that my career as a criminal defense barrister flourished, and I accepted briefs from murder to lesser misdemeanors. I resided at my elegant Georgian family home at Pimlico. My parents had both passed away, and I lived with an elderly widowed aunt. Aunt Lenore was a magnanimous woman who in her adulthood had counselled women in refuges, and had persuaded me to represent those that were greatly underrepresented. It was she who encouraged me to understand each prisoner's psychology, in order to ascertain why they committed a particular crime. Murders, for example, often unearthed buried family secrets and scandals. Quite often the murderer had been a family member rather than a complete stranger. Though I had defended many unfortunate souls, I admit I had dealt with countless wicked minds. The memories of my exchanges with them in prison and seeing them at the gallows haunted me. The knock on the door jolted me out of my morbid contemplation. I cleared my throat. "Yes, do come in." Martindale opened the door and greeted me with the most jovial of salutation. He was breathless. "Clyde, you won't believe why I'm here." He hastily seated himself on a chair in front of my desk and removed his soaked hat. His grey eyes were gleaming. Something had clearly excited him. That was always the case with Martindale. Each time he approached me with a notable case, no matter how grisly and gruesome the details, he was always exhilarated. "You have read the papers, I presume?" He looked at me inquiringly. "I'll be candid with you, Martindale, I have not. I haven't quite been myself recently. Perhaps the memory of what happened still haunts me." I put my fingers on my eyes as I felt a mild pain in them, which I knew would culminate in an excruciating headache, something which I had frequently experienced in the last few months, ever since the hanging. "All right, then, so you don't know." He folded his arms and glared at me in a childlike manner. He was a man in his 50s, yet there was always something so jolly and simple about Martindale that made him resemble a young, ambitious university student. "No, Martindale, what has happened now?" I sighed. "Dominic Adler is dead. Murdered." I was aghast. Dominic Adler was a renowned Queen's Counsel, and quite frankly a man I had disliked for his arrogance and his debaucherous ways with women. But to hear that he had been murdered was shocking, to say the least. "What? Good God! I saw him a few nights ago. As I walked back home, I saw him at a public house at Holborn. Through the window, I mean. He was arguing, it seemed, with a woman. I couldn't quite see her, as her back was towards me. However, Adler kept hitting his fist on the table, as if he were agitated." Martindale tapped his fingers on my desk and raised his eyebrows. "I see. That is intriguing." He peered at me. "Have they found who may have done it?" Martindale stopped tapping his fingers and continued peering at me. A grin crept across his face. He stroked his whiskers. Then he spoke. "They have. It's a woman. She's young and very beautiful. Now let me explain the facts to you. According to Adler's valet and the housekeeper, he returned to his residence in Richmond around 7 o'clock the day before last. He was sober. At about 7:30, a visitor rang the bell at his residence. The housekeeper, Louisa, who answered the door, said that she did not recognize her. The woman in question told Louisa that she had an appointment with Adler pertaining to the advert in the London Herald for the governor's position. When Louisa informed Adler of the visitor, who at the time was in his study, he seemed agitated, but asked the housekeeper to let her in, and that they ought not to be disturbed. The study is on the ground floor of his abode. It was a little after 8 o'clock that Louisa, who was washing the dishes in the scullery, heard noises. She closed the tap to hear what was happening, and that is when she heard Adler's screams. Alarmed, she ran out of the kitchen door to the garden where Timothy the valet was smoking a cigarette. Apparently he didn't hear anything whilst he sat in the stables, not to mention the fact that it was raining heavily that night. But upon Louisa's frantic cries, he stormed into the study, the door to which was unlocked. Upon entering the room, both Louisa and Timothy witnessed the blood-drenched carnage. Adler lying on the floor in a pool of blood, and standing above him, the young woman. She stood still. According to the servants, she looked profoundly nervous and kept mumbling, "I didn't do it." Timothy then restrained her whilst Louisa ran out of the house to fetch the nearby Bobby making his rounds. Once the police arrived and investigated the premises, they did not find the murder weapon. However, they found a pocket knife on the prisoner, which she claimed she carried at all times for her protection. Martindale stopped talking and gulped down the water I had poured out for him. He then wiped his moustache with his handkerchief. I had to admit the facts were very intriguing. How bizarre. When you say pool of blood, how exactly was the injury caused to him? An autopsy carried out confirmed that Adler's skull and nose had been crushed. He was struck with a heavy object several times. Good grief. And apart from the pocket knife, no weapon was found. Well, the police are investigating the study to see what the possible instrument could be. The pain in my eyes intensified. I too took a sip of water. What about Adler's wife? Where was she? Priscilla Adler lives in Tunbridge Wells with their 2 sons. She barely visits the Richmond residence, so I've been told. Martindale again continued tapping his fingers. The grin reappeared on his face. I sighed. I think I know why you're here, but I don't wish to say it. Tell me. I spoke in a grave tone. Martindale burst into laughter. Well, you've guessed it now. Yes, I want you to represent her. She's pleaded not guilty at the coroner's inquest this morning, but the jury found her guilty nonetheless. It was an open and shut case, so to speak. She did seem shattered, but insisted that she didn't do it while standing in the dock. Well, don't they all? But if you ask me, there was something so lovely about her. I almost believe she's telling the truth. I attended the inquest, you see, and decided immediately that you are the man for her. Here is the brief, he said, slamming it on my desk. I suppose it's too early to say that she's innocent, wouldn't you agree? I don't know if I'm ready for another murder, Martindale. It's too soon. Martindale leaned forward and looked at me paternalistically. I know it's been difficult for you, Clyde. I know you have a kind heart, but perhaps it's time for you to once again fight for justice. Do it for Susan Taylor. Martindale had touched on the very subject I had been contemplating all morning. I shook my head. He persisted. I believe the trial date at the Old Bailey will be announced soon. You can accompany me to the Surrey House of Corrections now to meet her. She needs someone to bring her justice. You know the others won't. Adler was a most influential Queen's Counsel. You know most of the other barristers will not defend a woman accused of murdering him. Now at least come and see her. You might change your mind about her when you meet her." I looked at Martindale confusedly, deliberating over my decision. His manner was very convincing. I didn't want another Susan Taylor to die. I didn't want another injustice done on my account, and so I replied, a little hesitantly though, all right, you really do know how to persuade me, don't you? Do lead the way." Martindale clapped his hands and jumped up excitedly. I threw on my overcoat, and as Martindale opened my office door, I inquired, "I completely forgot to ask, what is her name?" He again beamed at me and said, "Naomi Byron."